Today we will, so when we talk about the science of logic, I have been teaching sort of, let's say, the foundations and the history, which is not to say that it's somehow separate. These are all the texts that we've been reading and studying all feed into this discourse of what we call pramāṇa. And when we talk about the science of logic, most specifically, we're talking about this word, pramāṇa, which is from the Sanskrit root ma, same as the Greek and English meter, metric, measure. Literally, a pramāṇa is an instrumental construction, meaning it's in the instrumental case in Sanskrit grammar. So a prameya is that which is known. A pramāṇa is how you know it. How do we know what we know? Seems like a simple question. I think even a moment's consideration reveals it to be quite tricky. In English translation, you will often see this word pramāṇa translated as something like a means of knowledge or a means of trustworthy awareness, an instrument of reliable knowledge, something like this. There's this qualifier, reliable, authoritative even, and gets snuck in there. The Pramāṇavārttika, the commentary on Pramāṇa by Dharmakīrti, a figure I've mentioned a couple of times, is the beating heart of this discourse in the Buddhist tradition, Indian and Tibetan. The second chapter, so there's 4 chapters in the Pramāṇavārttika. 2 of them, the first and the fourth, have to do with inference. The third has to do with perception. The second, pramāṇa siddhi, siddhi like a city, like a mahasiddha, establishing pramāṇa of what? Of the Buddha. The second chapter of the Pramāṇavārttika, in a sense, you could say a work on logic or epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? Is entirely concerned with establishing the authoritativeness of the Buddha as a source of knowledge. Recently, I've been on a kick. I like the word scientific rather than reliable or authoritative, just kind of loose. I think scientific maybe captures more precisely and better than much Western discourse what we mean by this reliability of knowledge. I've mentioned before, I think yesterday, and a couple times. Yes, please. Certain, indubitable, unquestionable.
On one of my podcasts last week, discussing science, was the purpose was to explore ignorance.
I would say to remove ignorance, but sure, explore en route to removal. In the, so Again, it's important to keep in mind in the Indian context where this literature originates, there is much going on before, during, and after the Buddhist contributions to this discourse outside of the Buddhist tradition. The discourse of pramāṇa predates the Buddhist contributions to the discourse. In fact, it arises out of the Sanskrit grammatical tradition, which is why there's this issue or this emphasis on the instrumental case. Sanskrit grammar in the Vedic worldview and for the non-Buddhists for the most part, other than the Jains, maybe the Sankhyas, Sanskrit grammar is a reflection of the cosmos. The way that Sanskrit is put together is the way that the world is put together. This is roundly rejected by the Buddhist tradition, this way of looking at things. And so, whereas in the other traditions, there are different lists of pramānas, for example, comparison, analogy, upamana in Sanskrit is considered to be a pramāna by some. Anupalabdhi, non-perception, the perception of absence, you could say perhaps the absence of evidence, is considered to be a pramāna by some. That's a very tricky point. I don't know that we'll have time to get into today, this whole question of when and under what circumstances is perceiving an absence a kind of evidence, reliable, a scientific evidence, yes? Dharmakīrti actually spends quite a bit of time on this question. But generally speaking, in the Buddhist tradition, there are only two pramānas. There's perception and there's inference. These are respectively non-conceptual and conceptual. The first work, you could say, of Buddhist pramāna literature is the Pramāṇa Samuccaya of Dignaga, who in the Tibetan tradition is sort of loosely, in fact, historically, there would have been at least one intermediating generation, but he was so close to Vasubandhu in intent and intellect that Dignaga is considered something of a direct disciple of Vasubandhu, spiritually, let's say. Similarly, Dignaga's direct disciple was Ishvarasena, and Ishvarasena's direct disciple was Dharmakīrti, but hardly anybody remembers it, poor Ishvarasena, who in any case, the tradition says, when Dharmakīrti started writing the Pramāṇavārttikam, Ishvarasena said, there's no point to my student, he has it from here, right? So we'll speak of Vasubandhu, Dignaga, and Dharmakīrti as basically a direct line. Dignaga was the first to really say, among the Buddhists, we reject all other pramānas except for these two. Why? Because there are only two objects of knowledge. There are only two pramayas. There is the particular characteristic, svalakshana, and there is the general characteristic, samanya lakshana. We'll talk more about those in a minute, but these words, at least svalakshana, should be familiar, hopefully, from day one, yes? What is a svalakshana? Particular characteristic. What is a dharma? That which holds or bears its particular characteristic. In the packet, I provided selections from the beginning of the second chapter and the beginning of the third chapter, and then some other selections from the third chapter of the Pramāṇavārttika. The second chapter, as I said before, is concerned with establishing the authoritativeness of the Buddha. It begins. Well, so, and here we have this is from John Donne's excellent translation, again, canonical translation, together with Devendra Buddhi's commentary. Devendra Buddhi was Dharmakīrti's direct disciple. He, namely the Blessed One, i.e. the Buddha, is an instrument of knowledge, i.e. a pramana, because he is similar to an instrument of knowledge. An objector asks, but what is the nature of an instrument of knowledge, such that you claim that he is similar to it? Dharmakīrti then writes, and this is the first line of the first verse of the Pramāṇa Siddhi, establishing the pramana-ness of the Buddha. An instrument of knowledge is a trustworthy awareness. As for that trustworthiness, having determined the object, when one then acts upon it, that thing's causal capacity is established. Hence, in one sense, the trustworthiness is that that thing has the kind of nature which it is asserted to have. This kind of trustworthiness is a quality of the object. When one knows it as such, the awareness is trustworthy. This is a quality of the subject. Now here we got to be careful, because we're not talking about, we'll be talking about phenomenal subject and object, I think, more tomorrow. Here we're not talking about that kind of subject and object. We're talking about over here, subject, S, is predicate, P, has a quality, has a particular characteristic, because E, evidence. This is the basic syllogism of Buddhist logic, so-called. Subject, that object we're investigating, that thing we're analyzing, attempting to determine its characteristics, has some particular, there's some quality we may predicate of this object, and we know this reliably, authoritatively, scientifically, because of some evidence. So right off the bat, I want to emphasize the picture here is the Abhidharma picture, right? This is what we were talking about on day one. In fact, the word for subject in Sanskrit here is dharmin. Word for predicate is dharma. Could be a little confusing. But that which has a quality and the quality which is possessed, right? What is it that makes evidence reliable? When is evidence good evidence? Repeatable. Okay, that's good. Someone else? Paul? When is evidence good evidence? Leo, when is evidence good evidence? Reputable source. What makes a source reputable? That's about persons, which is fine, but this is I mean, now there's an asterisk, of course, right, on this whole question of what's a pramana, because we say there are only two, and then we say the Buddha is a pramana. So this is perhaps a little loosey-goosey, but the point is that the Buddha is very much an exception, or a special case, right? Generally speaking, when we're talking about means of scientific knowledge, means of certain knowledge, authoritative, reliable, trustworthy, whatever. There are only two. This word this Sanskrit word, I put underneath here. Svabhava pratibandha. Svabhava should be familiar. Pratibandha. Prati is kind of, again, one of these, Sanskrit, you like to have these little prefixes that don't necessarily mean much or somewhat context dependent. Bandha is like a rubber band, bound, bind. Svabhava pratibandha. If you read John's book, he translates this as, I think, essential concomitants, which is good, but technical. Really what it means is there is an essential relationship in the nature between two things. Is this cup white? Is mug white? Yes. Right? Within the bounds of language. Again, there's a lot of this has to do with language use. What is the relationship between the whiteness of the cup and the cup itself? We're going to let go of the particles for just a second. We can say that there's something about the essential nature of the constituents of the cup, or the cup itself, that's white. There is an inherent, which is another kind of good translation sometimes for svabhava, there's an inherent relationship the key point of pramana, of Buddhist pramana literature, is causality. Please.
Whiteness in the cup, different things. There's an inherent relationship with the cup.
In the moment, sorry, go on.
No, yeah, they're different. Is the whiteness on the cup, or?
No, it's a great question, and that this gets again to this gets to the heart of why we talk about there being two pramanas. Because yes, the key point is the inherence, the unbreakable causal, because it's causal, it's direct. Yes? So in a moment, we're going to analyze in more depth and detail the relationship between the whiteness and the cup. But if you wanted to say, if you want to talk about this particular cup, right, as opposed to some other cup, how do I know? Okay, let's say I, Alex, only drink out of white cups, right? So you see a blue cup, you may reliably infer that this is not my cup, right? There is an inherent causal relationship between the evidence the whiteness of the cup, and it's being mind, the cup that I drink out of. Dharmakīrti likes to use the example of a seed and a sprout. When apple seeds produce apple trees, they don't produce oak trees. Acorns produce oak trees, they don't produce apple trees, right? So there's an inherent causal relationship. If you see an oak tree, you may reliably infer that it was produced from an acorn. If you see an apple tree, you may reliably infer that it was produced from an apple seed. So in all cases, it's this close and inherent causal relationship that is what's guaranteeing the knowledge. Why am I talking about inference so much? I said there are two on the board. I wrote perception, and we'll get there in a second. Why am I talking about inference so much? As I mentioned earlier, of the 4 chapters of the Pramāṇavārttika, 2 have to do with inference, only 1 with perception. And in general, Buddhist pramana literature is, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly, but you would be forgiven for thinking that it was primarily concerned with inference. Why? Talk about, yeah, please. Okay. Is pure appearance, we'll get there, we'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll talk about that tomorrow. It's a great question. Inference in this system is most of what we mean by knowledge on a day-to-day basis. Perception, to sort of, we'll get there in a second again, but there are 4 kinds of perception. Sensory perception is only one of them. When we're talking about knowledge and how do we know what we know, for the most part, we're talking about inference. Why? Because it's conceptual, and most times, every day, day by day, we spend our time thinking in concepts. Yes, please.
So, in evolutionary theory, we speak of accidents, that the successful accident is the one that survives. And this would be inference. Birds do not have wings to fly. They fly because they have wings.
Sure. I mean, the question here, so that's a the question here is also about, and I think that's a good reminder, it's about goals. I should also mention at the outset, before we go too much further, there is no separating in this system, in this picture, knowing from attaining some goal. Knowledge is always a knowledge for some purpose, directed towards some end. So in that sense, in some ways, not the opposite of the evolutionary picture, but famously, natural selection is somewhat random, or there's no directedness. That's not what's going on here. Here we are, well, I'll just read. The trustworthiness of an instrumental cognition does not consist of the fact that one definitely obtains the desired object through that instrumental cognition. Instead, it consists of the fact that one obtains only the desired object through that instrumental cognition. When one acts, the instrumental cognition is what makes one obtain the object. Therefore, a cognition's instrumentality consists of its capacity to make one obtain the desired object. I will read that again. Therefore, a cognition's instrumentality, which is to say it's, this is a translation of the Sanskrit word pramāṇa, which is another construction, grammatical construction on the same underlying form, yes? A cognition's instrumentality, its trustworthiness, its reliability, consists of its capacity to make one obtain the desired object. Since just that capacity is said to be the trustworthiness of the instrumental cognition, there is no problem concerning obstructed action. The classical example, the famous example here is smoke and fire on a mountain. We are cold. We want warmth, or we need fire to cook with, or whatever. We do not see fire. We do not perceive fire with our senses, but we see smoke on a distant mountaintop. Therefore, we may reliably infer the presence of fire from the presence of smoke due to the svabhava pratibandha, the necessary causal relationship between smoke and fire. Now here someone clever objects. What about smoke that's not caused from fire? What about dry ice? What about? Actually, Dharmakīrti, because he's very bright, addresses this in similar objections. The short answer is, number one, when we're talking about this svabhava pratibandha, this binding between the svabhavas, the inherent natures of the cause and the effect, it's only that kind of smoke which necessarily arises from, let's say, a wood fire that's under discussion. Furthermore, in a subsidiary point, if you're very careful in your analysis, if you pay really, really close attention to, let's say, what looks like smoke that comes from dry ice, you can see that it's not quite the same thing, right? Maybe looks similar in certain ways, but it's not quite the same thing. The causal characteristics are somewhat different.
CO2 is
Right, for starters. I had wanted to talk about perception before I got to apoha, but this is probably a good chance, and since Hillary requested that I talk about apoha, this is what we're getting at. So I said this word apoha means exclusion. The full form, you'll see it referred to as both, is anya apoha, anya meaning other exclusion. Yeah, actually, let me write it out because I don't want to. And in fact, I can, presumably everybody got svabhava pratibandha, and you should have svabhava already. So this is anya apoha, the exclusion of what is other. is the basis of inference. Pramāṇa samuccaya, Dignaga. 5th chapter is all about apoha. This is Dignaga's contribution. His this is Dignaga was this whole thing about apoha really starts with Dignaga. Dharmakīrti takes it and runs with it. What is apoha about? Well, to some extent, it depends on, are you talking about Dignaga's apoha or Dharmakīrti's apoha? Okay, what is Dignaga's apoha? We have in this room a number of desks, right? We have, what are these little, I don't know what they're, desk you could call them, little standing folding things, right? I count 9. So, in Dignaga's terminology, you would say each one of these is an individual. We have 9 individual desks. Each one is different. You could say at a microscopic level, or perhaps one has a scribbling on it. There's any number of ways in which they're all different from each other. Perhaps one has a missing screw, even if they don't, right? They were made at different times by necessity, even if they were made in the same factory. One was made on one day, the other was made on a different day. Their causal histories are different. And yet, in language, we can speak of them all as being a desk, right? And I say, bring me 9 desks, and you know what I'm talking about, right? Why? Because despite their differences from each other, despite the fact that they're all each a unique, in some sense, individual, for the purpose of attaining some goal, with some practical purpose in mind, we can ignore those differences. I sometimes like ignore better than exclude for apoha. That also has this resonance of ignorance, right? There's a conceptuality is ignorance. There's a very famous statement of Dharmakīrti. Vikalpameva hi avidya, for conceptuality just is ignorance. So what does it mean to conceptualize? It means to ignore differences. We ignore the differences between the desks in order to group them together. Please. Correct. Ignorance just is conceptuality.
Well, wanting to conceptualize would be to differentiate.
Strictly speaking, you could, yeah, so you can speak of conceptual, yes, the reverse is also true. That yes, where things are one and you split them up, that's also conceptuality, yes. Correct. 2 sides of the same coin. No, it's fine.
For decades, the evolution of beauty, it is my amazement that Darwin in 1870 was able to write the second law of evolution about female mate choice driving evolution. And I had not read any of his original work, how he came to this, and yet other scientists for 100 years could, you know, the evidence was there. And and the law was there, you know, his own observation of female mate choice. And yet, it was
So the question, so we have a that's so the question here as I'm hearing is we have a bunch of observations, we call them perceptions, and then we have a bunch of inferences, right? And so the question is, how do we attain reliable knowledge, scientific knowledge? Under what conditions do our observations allow for reliable inferences? Yes.
What makes Darwin?
I mean, lots of things. I don't. What do you?
Like what? So we have what you just said.
Yeah.
We have Darwin writing out the differences, coming up with a theory, telling us what the world is like.
Mm-hmm.
What makes Darwin unreliable and Buddha?
I don't know that Darwin's necessarily unreliable, but what I will say is, yeah. So in this system, the question again is all about. I actually skipped over and I was like, no, I should go back. Instrumentality is known through practical action. Pramāṇavārttika, chapter 2, verse 5. Instrumentality is known through practical action. Another word that comes up a lot is purusha artha. Purusha meaning person, artha meaning lots of stuff. Goal, telos, purpose, dön in Tibetan. Some also benefit. Purusha artha, the benefit to people, the personal goal. What is the goal? What is Darwin's goal? What is, or whoever, right? You know, Heisenberg or whoever. What is the goal? It's not the end of suffering, right? It's not nirvana. It's something else, or maybe indirectly, but certainly not front and center. So that's what I would say is the first and foremost difference. And we'll talk about this more tomorrow, because when we talk more in depth about reflexive awareness and per Craig's question, what was it? Pure appearances? Yes, pure appearances tomorrow.
science, and the purpose is to predict, to when you talk about reliability and trustworthiness, is the ability to predict.
Right. And why can we predict? Why is scientific knowledge so good at prediction? Because of, I erased it, but svabhava pratibandha, right? This inherent causal relationships. When we correctly ascertain causal relationships, that allows us to attain our practical goals more readily, right? But there's a subtlety here that I don't want to gloss over. To get back to what I was saying before about the difference between Dignaga and Dharmakīrti, Dignaga is great, and this is not intended as a slight, but he's quite sloppy in his use of language and in his philosophizing. He's not a rigorous thinker, he's not a systematic thinker. Dharmakīrti is much more like a mathematician or a logician, much more precise. And so he sort of quietly, respectfully sweeps aside the rough edges of Dignaga's system. Because you'll notice, I was sort of hinting at this earlier with the cup and then again with the desks. Okay, we can say that each desk is an individual, or in the more common example that Dignaga uses and then gets sort of picked on by non-Buddhist critiqued, criticized, is cows. What's a cow? Well, it's not a non-cow. A cow is the set of all things that are not linguistically identifiable as a cow. What's a desk? It's the set of all things that's not linguistically identifiable as a desk. Because let's go back to the fire and the smoke on the mountain, right? Let's say I don't have any, I'm freezing to death in the wilderness. I'm not concerned with writing nice notes on a Buddhist philosophy class. It's the farthest thing from my mind. I need warmth and I need it now. Suddenly, that desk is not a desk, it's fuel for a fire, right? Now my goals have changed. Now my picture has changed. Now we're no longer talking about something to write on comfortably in a nice air-conditioned room. Now we're talking about something I want to burn to make warmth, to survive. So the question of what specific causal characteristics we're interested in is not separate from the question of how are we thinking about this object? How are we talking about this object? How are we conceptualizing this object? Thought, language, conceptuality are all over here in inference world is one of the key things I want to emphasize. Which is why, to get back to something else I said earlier, this is where most Buddhist logic happens, or Buddhist, whatever you want to. This is what the primary concern is, or like by weight, by volume of amount of material written. This is what happens, and if you see, like the formalized debate, like in the right, that's this. That's all variations on basically challenging. Well, you say, the cup is white because it looks white. But if you change the color of the room, you put everything in orange light, suddenly the cup looks orange. So that's not reliable. So that's a bad inference. Ultimately is the idea. Because, and this is the other key point, is when you talk about perception, so in Sanskrit, literally, let me write it out. It's another good word to know. Pratyaksha, which may be further subdivided into prati plus aksha. So, if you're just reading Sanskrit poetry or whatever, prose, it doesn't matter, you'll see this word pratyaksha all over the place. Sometimes it means perception. More commonly, in a sense more literally, means direct. Direct. Unmediated. Inference, literally, I won't write it out, anumāna in Sanskrit, almost, you could say mediated. Mediated versus unmediated or immediate. Most literally, pratyaksha, when you split it up, prati, against, aksha, the eye. What is perception? What is direct perception? It's when something hits your eye, right? To perceive directly in this picture, and I'll say more about this in a second, to perceive directly is to not have any conceptual overlay whatsoever. That is not how we live our lives, right? As a practical matter. I was writing on the blackboard with a pen. If I didn't have some perhaps subtle, but nevertheless quite present sense, like this is a pen. It is a thing I use to write. I identify it as the thing I need. This is the blackboard. This is the thing I write on for the purpose of, teaching this class. Now, say I needed to dig a particularly small circumference hole in the ground. This is no longer a writing implement. This is an instrument for digging a particularly small hole in the ground, right? To get back to the cows and the desks, talking about individuals. We know, because we've studied Abhidharma, that in fact the desk is not an individual. And cow is not an individual. It's an aggregate. It's a composite. So in the Dignaga picture, when we're talking about ignoring the differences, so the charges of circularity, right? Dignaga will say in the Apoha chapter of the Pramāṇa Samuccaya, what is a cow? Well, it's that which is not a non-cow. This sounds maybe silly. The point is not as silly as, I do want to defend him. Paul, did you have a question, or was it? Oh, I do want to defend this somewhat. It's not as silly as it sounds. It's not quite as silly as it sounds. The point is, there are things out there in the world that fulfill the functions, the practical functions expected of a cow. They are able to be milked. They have a hump and a dewlap, right? There are things, maybe edge cases or maybe not edge cases, that fail to fulfill those characteristics. So when we say the word cow, or when we think equivalently of a cow, we don't mean things that are not cow, things that fail to provide us with the expected causal characteristics, again, per this SSP because E. We mean those things which don't fail to provide us with the expected characteristics. So it's not I think Dignaga's position is defensible. I think it's also unnecessarily sloppy and creates more problems ultimately than it solves, perhaps. Yeah.
Talking about perception and these new words about direct, unmediated perception. So instrumentation, which enhances our perception. A microscope, not a scope.
I'll get to. I want to close out for now on concepts and inference, and then I'm going to talk about perception in a minute, because that's a great. Yes, this is my own thought. This is my, again, I was a physics major when I encountered this the first time. Because we studied Abhidharma, we know that a cow itself is a kind of conventional designation for an aggregate of particles, physical particles, and cognitions and feelings and perceiving. The cow is a sentient being, right? So it has 5 aggregates. And those aggregates themselves are aggregations. Speak of the heap of cognitions, right? So Dharmakīrti refines this picture quite considerably. And instead of speaking of the objects, our sort of common sense objects, as individuals, Dharmakīrti brings it back to the particles, to the indivisible individual constituents, to the dharmas, let's say. So now we can still, for Dharmakīrti, it's not, we don't lose the ability to group these desks together as desk, right? But now, in this more refined and more subtle picture, what we lose really is the ability to say that the desk, the cow, the cup, whatever, is meaningfully an individual, is a unity, because it is not. We know it's not. Studied Abhidharma. What is it? What is the cup? What is the desk? It is an aggregation of particles. So what's going on? What's going on when we talk about the cup, when we identify, when we conceptualize or think about the cup as a cup? Well, there are all these particles, billions, trillions, quadrillions, whatever. They're all grouped together by our minds. We exclude, we ignore all of the characteristics of these particles, except for those which contribute to the practical function of being able to hold water, for example. So, scientifically, there are certain elements, right? This is probably what this is clay, looks like. Yeah. So, this is a cup made out of clay. I could have a cup made out of plastic, cup made out of metal. These are very different materials. In the sort of general Dignaga picture, we could say, well, we're ignoring, excluding these particular material characteristics in order to simply draw, we imagine, as in the imaginary nature, right? We imagine a sameness. The other word I wanted to write today. Svalakshana, we know, we should know. That's the particular characteristic, yes? Samanya Lakshana. Sama, as in same. Sameness. Similar. Sometimes general characteristic, that's very, very abstruse. It's the sameness. But it's fabricated. It's imagined. Right? So we can speak or think of the sameness of cups, a metal cup, a plastic cup, a clay cup, in terms of there being cups or not a not cup. If it has a hole in it at the bottom, doesn't hold water, not a very good cup. Doesn't fulfill the purpose we expect very well. But we can drill down further. And we can consider the cup, not, or whatever, the cow, desk, not as a gross object, but as an agglomeration of infinitesimal constituents. And these infinitesimal constituents themselves have an infinite variety of causal properties. Dharmakīrti is very explicit about this, no less than, well, Heisenberg or whoever. There is an infinite amount of information contained in each individual particle. There's a great book here, right here. Universe in a Single Atom. I forget which page it's on. I cited it's in my dissertation. There's a very famous metaphor of Indra's net, Indra's jeweled net. It's a vast net. Each joint in the net has a jewel which reflects all the other jewels in the net. Each particle contains all the information in the entire universe.
As well, the cells of body.
Right.
And in health, the new theories are coming out about and that our body is like the United Nations, and that our mind unites all these little entities into a, that we're our practice develops a focus of this United Nations body.
Well, that's the right. This whole that's the key point that I really want to get across is the grouping together is the conceptualizing. And in particular on the Dharmakīrti picture, not as much on the Dignaga picture. To think of a solid object as a kind of United Nations, as you put it, it's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, nothing would get, couldn't function in the world if I couldn't, conceptualize, not being a Buddha, if I couldn't conceptualize the pen as a pen and blackboard as a blackboard, I would be helpless. Nothing would get done. But it's an artifact of ignorance. It's a result of this beginningless tendency to conceptualize this, which is the same thing as the beginningless ignorance. These are not actually distinct. Before I move on to perception, Hillary, did you have any other questions or specific questions? Or something I didn't address, something you'd like me to address that I haven't gotten to?
If there's any way you could talk about how we can think of Poha as specifically as a practitioner in terms of how
we what, sorry?
I just found it when I learned about it mind blowing. Hope you.
Excuse me, I need to pick up my agenda.
No worries.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Of course. How relate to a Poha as practitioners? I mean, I think it's, to me, mostly about paying really close attention to what to like, let's say mental hygiene or conceptual hygiene, like what goes into our, say, practice. What do you mean by practice, right? What do you include in practice and what do you exclude from practice, right? Your concept of practice, we take these things for granted. Perhaps you could say it's context dependent. In a very similar way to when we talk about perception. Dharmakīrti, following Dignaga, says there are 4 kinds of perception, but really there's only one, right? We say there's practice. I would never denigrate things like doing sang or whatever, walking meditation, or there's all sorts of things we call practice. But if you get right down to it, if you really want to be a stickler, what do we mean by practice? We don't even really mean shamatha. If you want to be a stickler, we don't even really mean vipassana. If you want to be a stickler, right? We mean one very, very specific thing. You could call it resting in the natural state or whatever. So you could exclude anything that isn't resting in the natural state from practice. And if you want to be really, really precise, I mean, that's just the most accurate you can be. Or you could widen the scope somewhat, not exclude as many things. And for practical purposes, I mean, practical in the sense of leading us along the path, that's very beneficial. Again, I'm not denigrating practices that aren't that. I'm simply saying, number one, this is always going to be context dependent. And number two, to me at least, I don't know if this answers you, I hope it answers your question, I don't know. Really, the key point is being able to pay very, very close attention to what goes into our ideas and understanding that there's always a cut that's being made. There's always a cut that's being made. The only time there's not a cut being made is in reflexive awareness, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Which is when I said there's 4 kinds of perception, but there's really only one. The really only one is reflexive awareness. It's a good opportunity, I hope, to, yeah. So we said there are, well, actually, before, so chapter 1, Pramāṇavārttika, inference for oneself. How do I, myself, me, understand the truth for myself? How do I attain reliable knowledge? Chapter 4, how do I help others attain reliable knowledge inferentially? Inference for the sake of others. Chapter 2, establishing the Buddha as an authoritative source of knowledge. Chapter 3, which is where I've done my most work, is on perception. What do we mean by perception? Dharmakīrti writes, instrumental cognitions, i.e. pramanas, are of 2 kinds because there are 2 kinds of objects. There are 2 kinds of objects because some objects are capable of telic function, which is doing stuff, exerting real causal power. There are 2 kinds of objects. There are objects that can exert real causal power and those that can't. Objects that can exert real causal power, we call sphalukshanas, i.e. dharmas, real things. Objects that cannot exert real causal power, samanya lakshanas, i.e. concepts. Concepts have no causal power. That's another maybe answer to your question, Hillary. Concepts have no causal power. They are just fabrications. They are not real, except as, in a sense, like mental events. We'll get there maybe another time. Any thought, any idea, no matter how subtle, can't do anything. The cup can do stuff. It can hold water. The particles of the cup can come together in a certain arrangement to hold water. The ideas in our head do not hold any water. There are 2 objects because some are similar across instances and others are not similar, because some are the objects of words and others are not the objects of words. And because the cognition of some occurs when there are causes other than the object, and the cognition of others does not occur when there are causes other than the object. In this context, that which is capable of doing real stuff, doing real work, exerting real causal power, is said to be ultimately real. The other one is said to be conventionally real. The particles in the cup, you could say, are ultimately real because they can hold water. Our idea, our thought, the word cup. The word cup doesn't hold any water, so it's conventionally real. These are respectively the particular and the universal. This is philosophy language, but it's common enough. You may hear it elsewhere. Particular, universal. And here is a very, and those are the first 3 verses. 4th verse is to sort of highlight some of the tensions, internal tensions to the tradition that I've spoken about. Someone who is by tradition said to be a madhyamaka argues, but nothing is capable of telic function. There are no svabhavas. There are no sphelogical. Haven't you read the Mula Madhyamaka Karika? To which Dharmakīrti replies, we observe that things such as seeds have a capacity for real causal work in the case of sprouts and so on. To which the Madhyamaka replies, such things are considered to have a causal capacity conventionally, not ultimately. To which Dharmakīrti replies, yeah, whatever. Astu yata tata in Sanskrit. Fine. We move on. That capacity for telic function is found in all objects. No, it is not found in universals, which are not found to have either positive concomitants or negative concomitants. This is this. So when you say S is P because E, then you say in the absence of E, there's no P on the part of S, right? It goes in both directions in terms of logical structure. The fact that a universal is not invariably concomitant with the cognition of a universal, which is to say that a concept is not invariably concomitant with the cognition of a concept, explains cognitions of supposedly extramental entities, such as substantial wholes, W-H-O-L-E, i.e. a water jug, projections, universals, numbers, and so on. They are not invariably concomitant with their cognitions because, like universals, the cognition of them follows from the presence of other factors, such as signs and mental effort. Meaning, you can think of a cup, you can imagine a cup, you can talk about cups endlessly without there ever being any cup, right? Or you can imagine a city of the Gandharvas is a classic example. Castle in the sky, the flower in the air. Insert your favorite imaginary non-existent thing here, God, right? Sorry? Horns on a rabbit. Yes, we can imagine all sorts of things. Our ability to imagine something has no, it's completely disconnected, right? This is why we draw this sharp distinction. Dharmakīrti draws a sharp distinction in particular between the objects of perception, which are real, causally efficacious, they can do stuff in the real world, and the objects of inference or conceptual thought. This distinction is, well, I'll get there. We'll finish just a few more verses. Things that, such as the hairs that appear to people with floaters. I've had floaters for, we all have floaters, we know like the floating hairs, as they're called, kesha in Sanskrit. Things such as the hairs that appear to a person are not universals because they're not considered to be objects. In other words, nobody mistakes floaters for real hair, right? They appear, but they're not real. The fault also does not ensue for those hair-like appearances when they are apprehended as objects by some other awareness. This is so because there's no reason to deny that they are apprehended as knowable objects. The clarity of the appearance of hairs in cognition is due to the fact that they are particulars, i.e. spheluxionas, in that they have the nature of awareness. However, thoughts such as these are hairs have universals as their objects. So the appearance of the floating hair is a particular. Appearances, non-conceptual sensory appearances, even if they're mistaken, just by virtue of the fact that they appear, the ability to produce an appearance is a real causal power. Thinking about, oh, I see the hair, that's just a thought, right? There's this crucial distinction between the appearance and the thought. Leo.
I see that distinction, but I also think that our thoughts and conceptualizations or visualizations or things like that can have causal like power or appearancy. Like for instance, if I really visualize and think about like, what I'm gonna eat for lunch, so salad.
Right. So this gets us to perception and this little diagram, which I did not make up. I mean, this is like my 2-minute rendition, but John has lovely slides animating something similar. If you read Bhikkhu K.L. Dhammajoti's book on Sarvaste Abhidharma that I highly recommend, and other books of his as well, you will see very similar diagrams, because this is Sautrantika. This is old Abhidharma that Dharmakīrti just uses. Because what? Because yeah, right? When you're talking about like salivating when you're imagining stuff, right? This is the key point of the hair example. Mental cognitions, even conceptual cognitions, do have a kind of causal power, but you can't eat an imaginary strawberry, right? The cognition, the vijnana dharma, is real. Nobody's saying that it's not real. The question is, what is the kind of causal power that it has? For our purposes, we can say there are two main kinds of causal power that it has. It has the ability to produce the next moment of awareness, and well, I guess that's, I mean, and the just whatever, functioning as a part of the 5 aggregates, right? Generally. What's not real is the conceptual content. So one and the same, so you can look at the cognition, you can look at an imaginary cognition in 2 ways. You can look at it as a mental event, in which case, yes, purely as a mental event, it has real causal power. But in terms of the conceptual content of that mental event, that's unreal. And this is where we're getting into, so the svalakshana is its mental eventness. The samanya lakshana is the lunchness, right? The lunchness doesn't do anything directly. The mental eventness is what has the causal power. So in terms of causal power and in terms of the picture here, and we'll speak more on this tomorrow. I want to go in more detail, particularly on reflexive awareness and perception. But just to close out, what are we looking at? A certain agglomeration of particles at time 0 when we start the stopwatch. We can ignore, for the purposes of the demonstration, all the subtleties of this agglomeration. We have a cup or a cow or desk or whatever. Okay. Because of momentariness, at time 1 instant later, 1/64th of a finger snap later, that's gone. No longer existent. Right? The object as it existed at time 0 does not exist at time 1. I don't know how familiar you are with like calculus notation. Here we have the first derivative and the second derivative. So time 0, we have the, let's call it original object. Time 1, we have its first causal descendant. Time 2, we have its second causal descendant. At time 1, schematically, in reality, it's going to be a little more complicated, but schematically, at time 1, when the original object no longer exists, the original object has exerted its causal power such that we now have a non-conceptual, direct visual cognition. In Western philosophy, this is sometimes called the time lag. Bertrand Russell talks about this, others too. there is always inherently a time lag between, like, necessary. I mean, the fact that light, as you know, famously takes time to travel means there is always a difference, an ontological difference between the object at what we see is a snapshot of the object as it existed at a prior time, not at the time we see it. And this is again, so this is like pre-Vasubandhu Abhidharma. Pre-Vasubandhu Abhidharma goes into depth and detail. This is actually a big argument. This is the core argument between the Sautrantikas and the Sarvastivadins. Why? Because for the Sarvastivadins, yes, at each individual, Sarvastivadins say phenomena are momentary. At each moment, each moment it exists, it exerts its causal power. However, the Dharma itself exists throughout the three times. So the Sarvastivada want to deny, they don't like this picture. They want to say, no, they have a very complicated thing that I won't get into, trying to explain away this problem. We don't need to bother with that because we're not Sarvastivadins. We're inheritors of Vasubandhu, Dignaga, and Dharmakīrti. And we acknowledge, yes, of course. What we see is a snapshot of what used to exist, not what exists at the time we're seeing. And by the same token, and this also, I think, maybe is another approach to Hillary's question, because again, it's really important to understand, like, inference is not bad. Conceptuality may be ignorance, but it's not, we couldn't function without it, right? If all we had were this non-conceptual visual cognition, we would be helpless. In order to function in the world, we must conceptualize the contents of our sensory experience. However, that in turn requires an additional passage of time and yet another layer of removal from the object as it existed. So, after having seen the cow, we recognize there's an operation of memory, and we conceptualize, that's a cow. Okay, now we're talking schematically 2 steps removed. It's not just that we're seeing the cow as it existed in the prior moment, we're conceptualizing our vision of the cow as it exists. So there's always like multiple steps removed, right? And that's something else to keep in mind as we go in terms of our practice and in terms of our daily lives. In a very real and scientifically explicit sense, what we see is not what is out there. We see mental representations. And so that was one last thing I'll write for today. Akara. We'll talk more about these tomorrow. Images, representations, different translations. Aspect sometimes. Form, phenomenal form. We see a phenomenal form produced by the object. We do not see the object directly. What we directly see is the image in consciousness produced causally. A real object, the sphalakshana, the object of perception, causally, because it is a sphalakshana, which is to say it has real causal power, produces an image in awareness. That is what we see. We do not see the object in and of itself. Questions? I know that was a lot. don't, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I'll get you in a second. It's not it's okay. It's a lot. It's not something, these are topics that are meant to be studied over and over. I've been studying the Pramāṇavārttika like 12 years. It doesn't happen overnight. Yes, Leo.
Thinking about whole like Yogacara and Namaska. So this is just saying like within the relative that object exists in a real way, and you see that an image of that because it's not necessarily real anymore at the time, versus like in Yogacara it'd be like all of that is like perception or like a fabrication of the mind.
Say that again.
So in this case, is it more like when we're talking about this object with this perception diagram? It's
Mhm.
more so based on the relative, like in that discussion between the Madhyamakan and the.
So that was why I sort of mentioned that bit about, the Madhyamaka. Dharmakīrti kind of dismisses that at the beginning. No, for Dharmakīrti is aware of the Madhyamaka perspective, and he's not exactly dismissive so much as like to take that seriously means there's nothing else to say. Like that's the end of the line, because like language, thought, conception, we got to throw all that away, and there's nothing more to be done. So if it's for us to continue our investigation, we have to set that aside. So in that diagram picture, the object is considered to be real, ultimately real, just insofar as it exists. Again, Dharmakīrti, what is real? Ultimately real for Dharmakīrti? That which exerts causal power, that which produces a real effect. Well, the sensory awareness that it produces is a real effect. Therefore, the object that produces it is real. So, and that's he doesn't use the terminology, but that's the dependent nature, right? That's a very Yogacara way of looking at it. Anyone else?
Say that sleeping exists beyond conceptualization.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by instinct, but something like preconceptual. This is where, it's a good question. This is where we get into, like I was saying before about, so according to Dharmakīrti, there are 4 kinds of perception. There's sensory perception, yogic perception, reflexive awareness, and I'm blanking on the 4th. Doesn't matter. But really, there's only one, which is reflexive awareness. So to say instinct, I think in the way that you're talking about it, is something like sensory awareness, where we can say it's non-conceptual or preconceptual, and that description can do a lot of work, right? Like if you want to analyze human behavior or animal behavior or whatever, you're going to want to put instinct in that sense closer to visual cognition than to like thinking about stuff, right? And yet, when you analyze it, you'll find there's this subtle, if not conceptualization per se, or maybe not the gross conceptualization, there's stuff going on that is not direct. There's a gap, there's a mediation. It's not purely immediate. In instinct in particular, you could talk about mediation through genetics or through conditioning, right? Really what perception is about in this system is immediacy, which is also why I think it's, to me at least, so helpful for understanding Mahamudra and Dzogchen when we talk about naked awareness, fresh and naked and bare in what sense? Unmediated, pure. To sort of spoil the conclusion for tomorrow, that's why reflexive awareness is, in the final analysis, the only real form of perception, because it's, well, real in the sense of the immediate. It's the only totally unmediated, totally direct type of awareness. Instincts like visual cognitions, auditory cognitions, sensory cognitions, even, and we could talk, yogic perception is not exact, it's not, it's a little subtle. If we have time tomorrow, we could talk, I think we should have time to talk a little about yogic perception tomorrow. But again, there's always the question here of context and purpose. What is the context you're talking about? What is your specific goal? In general terms, if you want to make a first pass approximation, I don't see the problem including instinct with visual cognition and calling it non-conceptual. But if you really want to drill down, you start seeing this description has problems. And these problems are only solvable by Rangig. Do you have something? Anyone else?
That's interesting, but what I'm getting at is how do you exist in this world without conceptualization? So my thought was, well, maybe you just follow the Brahmans.
I don't know how satisfying you'll find it. The classical answer to this, which is repeated by Ranakara in his Pith Instructions on the Ornament of the Middle Way, that I translated in my master's thesis, is one taste. All phenomena have one taste. And yes, in a sense, it's a kind of instinct. It's not instinct like an animal, running from a predator. You could call it an enlightened instinct, maybe. All when if you're really doing it, is the idea. Yes, then there's no longer any need to conceptualize. It's automatic. How does the Buddha know just what each individual sentient being needs? It's a kind of instinct. Yeah. Because all phenomena have one taste. And so when pure reflexive awareness is unhindered, unfettered, it's automatic and instinctual. Yeah.
That's what you say.
Is it instinctual? Pure reflexive awareness. Yeah, I mean, that's explicit. In Dharmakīrti is a little shy, I suspect, because he's more careful about the rhetoric of tantric secrecy. Dharmakīrti lived about 650 CE in Nalanda, where the Guhya Samaja Tantra and Mahavairochana Tantra were circulating. He would have been aware of what would later be called Mahamudra. It doesn't mention it, despite the fact that it's clearly relevant and clearly informing what he's doing. I like to think he's just very, very fastidious about keeping things secret. Other later authors are not so, well, it's just different, right? Different times. Things are a little you can speak a little more openly. And yeah, Maitripada in particular, famous figure in transmission history of the Kagyu lineage, was at Vikramasila Mahavihara, famously kicked out because he was supposed to be a monk. And well, there's argument over whether this story is true or not. Apocryphally, he had taken vows of celibacy and then broke them because he was doing tantric practice and had to leave. But he wrote very important commentaries, foundational literature in Mahamudra. He wants it to be more about Madhyamaka than Yogacara, but in terms of this reflexive awareness business, no, it's very clear. Very clear. And Saraha as well, great Mahasiddha and composer of the spontaneous, maybe spontaneous is a better word, because that's also a word that you'll see like come up in English translation of Mahamudra Dzogchen literature. Instinct, I haven't seen so much. Spontaneous is all over the place. Maybe even in like our stuff we have here, right? Yeah, this spontaneity, this immediacy of reflexive awareness. But that's for tomorrow. Maitripa taught Marpa, right? Taught Milarepa, Gampopa, that whole lineage, direct from India, direct from the great monastic universities. Thank you very much.